Okay, so we have come in our study of the Old Testament to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and I want to begin this morning, not at the beginning of Ezra, but sort of in the middle, so I would invite you to look with me at Ezra chapter 7, and there's an important point here that is related to some of the things I was just praying about, and I hope that you will see this point in the book of Ezra. I hope that you will lay hold on it, and I hope it will change your life. So, in Ezra chapter 7, I want to first draw your attention to the way that in verse 11, what's happening in this chapter is Ezra is being sent by Artaxerxes, the king of Persia. If you look at Ezra 7:1, now after this, in the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, during this king's reign, the king is going to send Ezra back to the land of Israel. So Ezra was probably born in exile over there in Persia. And just to set some historical context here, the temple was destroyed in 586 BC by the Babylonians, and then the Persians conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And Daniel tells us that he was there until the third year of the king of Persia. So that's the period of Daniel. And then when the Persians conquered Babylon, we'll see in just a moment in Ezra 1, they allowed anyone who wanted to return, any of the Jews who wanted to return to the land of Israel, to do so. And so a group of Jews, about 50,000, returned to Israel in the 530s BC, probably returning by 536 or so. And then in 516 BC, they got the temple rebuilt. And then they just sort of languished and they drifted. Eventually, we'll see in the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah's after. Ezra comes back to the land in 458 BC. So Ezra's parents and grandparents and great-grandparents evidently had not chosen to return to the land of Israel, which means that Ezra had grown up over there in Persia. And what we see here, and look at Ezra chapter 7, verse 11. This is a copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave to Ezra the priest, the scribe, a man learned in the matters of the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes for Israel. And as you read through the rest of this chapter, what you see is that Artaxerxes is commissioning Ezra to go back to the land of Israel and basically create peace there so that part of Artaxerxes' realm will be at peace, which means that Ezra is something like a foreign diplomat in the service of the king of Persia, which means that Ezra, even though he's a faithful Jew, even though he is learned in the law of the Lord and the statutes and the scriptures of Israel, it also means that he had to know how to navigate Persian society. It means that Ezra has probably flourished all his life and excelled in school as he grew up, such that, whatever training process that was, such that the king recognized, this is somebody that I want in my service. And then, I don't know if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. or trafficked with people who operate around the Capitol. You're dealing with very sharp people who are very ambitious, people whose days are full of both learning for themselves so that they can know what's going on, and then interaction with other people. These are people who are working it, you might say. These are people who know how to build relationships. They know how to make friends. They know how to communicate to someone in power that they can be of service and help. And then they know how to help that person in power to advance his interests. This is the kind of person that Ezra is. He's a mover and a shaker, and he's risen to power in the Persian court. I don't think that implies anything negative about Ezra. I think that everything that we read here about Ezra is that he was a faithful Jew. Now, I think that in the midst of all this, we can ask the question, what's motivating Ezra? And here, we sort of discern these things that I've been talking about from what the book tells us. This is not what Ezra tells us. Ezra doesn't say something like, I worked very hard to rise to prominence in the Persian court so that I could be the person that the king of Persia would send back to Israel so that I could be in position to make sure that the law of the Lord was enforced in Israel, which is what the king of Persia sends him to do. Look at verse 14 of Ezra 7. You are sent by the king and his 7 counselors to make inquiries about Judah and Jerusalem according to the Torah of your God, which is in your hand. So where did this idea come from? I think probably Ezra puts himself in position to be an advisor to the king, so that when the king comes to the place where he says, listen, we need to establish peace in that outpost of my kingdom known as Judah. What do we do to establish peace in Judah? I think Ezra is on the scene to say, well, the people of that place, they have this set of scriptures, and they believe, and I'm one of those people, and we believe that there's a God in heaven who has given us these instructions, and that if we live in this way, there'll be peace in that land. So, King of Persia, Artaxerxes, if you want peace in that land, I would suggest that you allow those people to make themselves happy and to live in accordance with the law of their God. And the king of Persia says, that sounds like a good idea, and I think you're the man to go there and help them do that. Now, all that to say, what does Ezra tell us about himself? What does Ezra tell us about himself? Because he doesn't say, you know, I worked hard in school, I climbed the ladder, I met all the right people. He doesn't say anything like that. Look at what he tells us about himself. And we'll just continue here in Ezra 7:1. Ezra, the son of Sariah, son of Azariah, son of Hilkiah, son of Shallum, son of Zadok. We recognize that name probably. That's a significant priest in the history of Israel. Do you hear what Ezra's doing? Ezra is recounting his lineage. Why is that a significant lineage? Because these are priests. That's why that's a significant lineage. Which means that Ezra is not identifying himself by the Persian education that he received. He's not identifying himself by the Persian neighborhood that he grew up in. He's not identifying himself by the roles that the Persian king has given to him. You see, he's not saying, you know, I was in this place and I was in this position and I this on my resume and I was given. No, he's telling you about who his heritage is, who his fathers were, because he's identifying himself as a priest of Israel. That's the way he's thinking of himself. And it goes on. He tells us that he's the son of Ahitub, son of Amariah, son of Azariah, son of Merioth, son of Zechariah, son of Uzi, son of Buki, son of Abishua, son of Phinehas. That's important because Phinehas was renowned for his zeal in Israel. You remember that story in Numbers about how that Israelite man had taken the Midianite woman into the tent, and Phinehas, in his zeal for the Lord, had gone in and run them through with a spear. And the Psalms commemorate Phinehas for this, and they say that it was reckoned to him for righteousness for all generations because he was zealous for the Lord, the God of Israel. So for Ezra to descend from Phinehas would be sort of like someone descending from, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln in our culture. And then it goes on. It goes on, son of Eleazar. Aaron, the first priest of Israel, had 4 sons. One of those sons was Eleazar, son of Aaron. So this is the lineage that's like, this is like a presidential candidate who could trace his heritage through Abraham Lincoln back to George Washington. And then on top of all that, he says in verse 6, this Ezra went up from Babylonia. He was a scribe skilled in the Torah of Moses. The language that's used here communicates that Ezra was swift in the books. And probably what that means is that he could find things. He knew where things were. He was ready to go. In scribal culture in this time, when you look at when you look at the materials that have come down to us, they are materials that aren't marked by what we might call reading aids. In other words, the words are all run together. You know, there are no spaces between the words. And it's an unpointed Hebrew text, which means that this is not the kind of book that it's going to be easy to just pick up and sight read. And on the basis of that information, from not only from ancient Israel, but also from other cultures in that world, people suggest that scribes like Ezra, in order for them to be skilled in these books, they basically had to know what was in those books before they picked them up to read them, because they had memorized the information. And if you've got the information memorized, well, then when you pick up a text that doesn't have reading aids and that doesn't have vowel pointings in the consonants, you know what words are supposed to be there, and you know how those words are supposed to be pronounced, so it's no problem for you to read the text. And that's probably what's going on with Ezra. He's probably a man who has the Torah of Moses memorized, which is like saying, this is not only someone who descends from George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, he also knows the Constitution backwards and forwards, and he's moral, and he's honest, and he's trustworthy. Because what this is telling us is that Ezra descends from Aaron through the line of Phineas and Zadok, and he's godly, and he knows the Bible, which is, if you're a person of the Bible, this is really exciting. So everything that Ezra is telling us about his identity is really pointing to his role in God's kingdom in accordance with God's purposes. Ezra is not identifying with Persia. Ezra is identifying with the kingdom of God. Ezra is not identifying with the false gods of Persia or the vain attempts to gain influence and power and pleasure in Persia. Ezra is thinking about God's purposes in the world. He tells us here in verse 6, he was a scribe, skilled in the Torah of Moses. And then look at this. These are these simple statements that communicate profound and sophisticated and nuanced understandings of what the Bible is. He's skilled in the Torah of Moses. Okay, so here, the Bible says Moses wrote the Torah. So anybody that comes along and says to you, well, obviously Moses didn't write the Torah, you just say to them in response, the primary sources claim that Moses wrote it. And I'm going to stick with the primary evidence from the ancient world, which is claiming that Moses actually wrote it. And then look at the sophistication of this. He was skilled in the Torah of Moses that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given. Who wrote it? Moses. Who gave it? The Lord. It came from God. There you have the human and divine origin of the scriptures of Israel. So the Bible is claiming for itself that it comes from God. The law of Moses that Yahweh, the God of Israel, had given. And so this is what is determining Ezra's world. In order for Ezra to be someone who is serving the king, probably like Daniel, you remember we saw in the book of Daniel that they taught him and his contemporaries, his three friends, the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And what they're trying to do when they teach him the language is they're trying to give him a new identity. They're trying to make him into a Chaldean, Babylonian magician or whatever. And then when they teach him the literature, they're trying to overwrite the mythology by which he explains the world, the stuff in the Bible, with their mythology by which they explain the world. Ezra probably had to know all that stuff too. And Ezra he's learned in the Torah, so very likely he is understanding Persian and Babylonian mythology through the lens of the truth that's in the Scriptures. And then we read that the king, in the middle of verse 6, granted him all that he asked. Okay, so probably Ezra's making requests. if you want peace in that part of the world, this is what I would propose that you do. And I would ask that maybe this is the way that you allow this to be pursued. And the king grants him all that he asks. Ezra doesn't say at the end of this, because Ezra was very clever and knew how to work the system. And he doesn't say, because Ezra was very diplomatic and he understood people and he knew how to frame the requests and he knew, although probably all that's true. Probably all, Ezra, I mean, a guy who's an idiot, a guy who's proud, a guy who is obnoxious, the king is probably not going to tolerate such a person. So Ezra probably is very diplomatic and very humble and very ingratiating in all the appropriate ways. He's probably somebody that the king is thrilled to have in his service. But look at how Ezra explains this. Ezra doesn't take credit for any of his skills at the end of verse 6. He says, "For the hand of Yahweh his God was on him." This is what explains for Ezra who he is and why he's prospering. God is blessing him. And then it goes on to list who else went with Ezra. And then verses 8 and 9 tell us that Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which is in the 7th year of the king. For on the 1st day of the month, he began to go up from Babylonia. And on the 1st day of the 5th month, he came to Jerusalem. So it's a 4-month journey from Persia to Jerusalem. And then he says again that they got to Jerusalem at the end of verse 9, for the good hand of his God was on him. And now everything that I've said to this point has been driving at verse 10. Because Ezra is a person, obviously, who's very ambitious. And Ezra is a person, I think we can see from this chapter, who wants to change the world. Ezra is a person who, in the words of our friend David Platt, he wants to shake the nations for the cause of the king of Israel. I mean, Platt says for Christ, but Ezra is saying, I think Ezra would be thinking in terms of God's kingdom and God's coming king. And he wants all the nations of the earth to come under the sway of God's king. And so now in verse 10, Ezra is going to tell us the route that he took to get to where he could be in position to change the world. Because now Ezra has the opportunity to go back to the land of Israel and to see that the law of God is enacted so that those people can begin to, I think this is his objective, those people can begin to experience shalom. They can experience the good life as God commanded and described it, and then God's glory can begin to radiate out from Jerusalem. I think that's what Ezra is after. And to get there, he tells us in verse 10, explaining of himself, for Ezra had set his heart to study the Torah of Yahweh and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Okay, so if we were to ask Ezra, how did you prepare? What did you do? His answer basically is, I sought to study the Bible and obey it. I sought to be faithful where I was. So I would say to you, do you want to change the world? Your path to that is the same path Ezra took. You are here at this seminary to study. And I would urge you to do what Ezra did. Study the Bible and then seek to obey it, and then out of that seek to teach it. And you remain faithful in that so that when the time comes and you're standing before some king. I mean, the Proverbs say, do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. And I think it's stuff like this, what we're seeing right here with Ezra. When the time comes and you're standing before some, I don't know who it's going to be. Maybe it's a Supreme Court justice. Maybe it's a governor of your state. Maybe it's a senator. Maybe it's a president of some institution. I don't know who it's going to be in your life. It could be the president of some other country. Who knows? But you're standing there. You want to be the person who is like Ezra, and you've studied the Scriptures, and you've done the Scriptures so that you have integrity, and then you're ready to teach. You're ready to make proposals. You're ready to change the world for the cause of God's kingdom, for the name of Christ in the world. This is where we are. This is where you are. You are, if we're now seeing Ezra at the moment when the time comes, there's a tree that has grown, and there are roots that have been planted by streams of water. And we are at the place where the roots are being planted. That's what we're doing here. And so I would plead with you not to allow other concerns to eclipse your devotion to your studies. You are here to study and learn the Scriptures. And I know there are lots of demands on your time. Many of you are married, you got children, you got to work, but then there are also other things that you could be involved in. And I would just urge you that now is the time that you have to study. So don't so fill your life that basically you don't gain anything from sitting here in class other than you got exposed to some things. You have to, if you want to learn, you have to give yourself time to read and to think and to process. And the Bible's a long book. It takes a long time to read the thing. You need to give yourself time to do that. So you can't so fill your schedule that you don't have any time for the Scriptures. Okay, so having seen this about Ezra now, and hopefully, I hope that you will. Recently, I heard an interview. Maybe I already mentioned this in this semester. I can't remember. Recently, I heard an interview with the mayor of London, and they asked him what the most influential thing that had ever happened in his life was, and he talked about being in grammar school and being forced to learn ancient Greek. That was the most influential thing in his life. He talked about how it taught him discipline. He talked about how it expanded his vocabulary. He talked about how it opened Homer to him. Because the next question was, what's the most influential book you've ever read? And the mayor of London said, no question, hands down, Homer in Greek. And we want to be people who have been impacted by the Word of God. You are here to learn the Bible. And I would plead with you to give yourself to Greek and Hebrew and to learn the Scriptures and to go as deep as you can in Greek and Hebrew. And then when the question comes, what's the most influential book you've ever read? You say something like Romans in Greek, or Psalms in Hebrew, or Isaiah in Hebrew. It'll change your life, the Bible will. Let's go back to Ezra chapter 1, and we'll see what Ezra is presenting as taking place here in this time period. Ezra, we've just seen he's a high-ranking official in the Persian court. So probably he has access to official records from both Persia and the empire that they conquered, Babylon. And so I think he's in position to write a book like this, where Ezra 1:1, we read, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So Ezra goes back to Jerusalem in 458 BC, but here he's telling us about events that took place in 539 BC. That would have been the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Now, mentioning Cyrus, for people who know the Scriptures, is going to recall some things, isn't it? If you're a person, let's say, who's thoroughly versed in the book of Isaiah, what would the mention of the name of Cyrus call to mind? It's going to call to mind the end of Isaiah 44 and the beginning of Isaiah 45, where the Lord, through Isaiah, names Cyrus, even before he comes on the scene, hundreds of years before he comes on the scene. So for Ezra to mention Cyrus here is for him subtly to claim the fulfillment of what Isaiah prophesied. He's narrating. He's not saying, hey, this fulfills the book of Isaiah, perhaps because he's got too much that he needs to communicate. And so he just takes it for granted that his audience is going to know the Scriptures, and they're going to recognize this. When he says, in the first year of Cyrus, bells and whistles are going to start going off. Hey, this is what Isaiah told us about. King of Persia. And then he says, this is why, he's got too much he's got to narrate. that the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Okay, so I would submit to you that in the first verse of his book, Ezra is presenting fulfillments of what both Isaiah and Jeremiah have prophesied. That the word of Yahweh by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. And then we get the proclamation detailed. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. This king Cyrus, he says this kind of thing about other gods and other peoples and other temples and other cities. So, this is not an indication that he's converted to the worship of the Lord. This is a guy who, in his mind, and we're going to see indications of this. In fact, look at the end of verse 3 where we read the phrase, he is the God who is in Jerusalem. So this is a guy who thinks that Yahweh is the Lord over Jerusalem, and then there are these other gods in these other localities, and what we need to do is we need to placate those gods. And so if that God over there in Jerusalem has given that law to that people, and that land to that people, and that's the God over that place, well, let's placate that God, and then we'll have peace in that place. And then we'll replicate that all around. That's the way that Cyrus is thinking about this, so we shouldn't think of him as a convert. Verse 3, whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place, with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Now, Ezra is not, again, he's not overtly making some statements here, but I would suggest to you that he's implicitly making some statements here. And the way that he's making these statements is by means of the pattern that he is employing. So think about the pattern here. You've got the Lord doing something to the heart of the foreign king, or the spirit of the foreign king. As a result of which, the foreign king allows God's people to go free. And as he allows God's people to go free, he also says all the neighbors and the people around God's people can give them silver and gold. And then he even goes on to talk about how, look down at verse 7, Cyrus the king also brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away. So Cyrus is even taking from wealth that in some sense he possesses, he's seized it, he's plundered it, but he's giving the Israelites implements for the worship of Yahweh in the temple that they're going to go out there and build. We've seen a pattern like this before, haven't we? God does something to the foreign king's heart. The foreign king allows the people of God to go free. And then the people of God, they receive gold and silver and all this wealth from their neighbors and such. And then they go out, and what do? They build a tabernacle using all that gold and silver. And they begin to worship Yahweh. You know what I'm talking about, right? I'm talking about the pattern of events at the Exodus from Egypt. And Jeremiah, there's several things going on, I think, in the claim to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. One aspect of it is Jeremiah prophesies in Jeremiah 16 and in Jeremiah 23. He says, days are coming when you will no longer say, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but as Yahweh lives, who brought the people of Israel out of the north country and out of all the countries to which he had scattered them. So what Jeremiah is saying is something like this. We identify the Lord by what he did for us at the Exodus, but he's going to do this new salvation for us that's going to overshadow and eclipse the Exodus, and we're going to identify the Lord then by that new salvation. And I think that, there and in many other places in the prophets, as we've seen, the prophets have pointed to this new Exodus. And I think that Ezra is presenting what's happening here as a kind of redo of the pattern of events that took place at the Exodus from Egypt. And with this, with all that new Exodus stuff that Ezra is presenting, Jeremiah had also said to his contemporaries in Jeremiah 27, verses 21 and 22, there were people in Jeremiah's day. So the king of Babylon had plundered these instruments that Cyrus gives back. And the false prophets in Jeremiah's day were saying, peace, peace. And Jeremiah's answer is, there is no peace. And they're saying, by the end of the harvest, by the end of the summer, we will be delivered. And that's why Jeremiah says in various places, the summer is over and the harvest has ended, and we're not delivered. And then, so another thing that they're saying is, yeah, the Babylonians have carried off the implements for worship of Yahweh in the temple, but those are quickly going to be brought back. And Jeremiah's reply to that in Jeremiah 27 is, thus says Yahweh concerning the vessels, this is Jeremiah 27:21, that are left in the house of the Lord, in the house of the king of Judah and in Jerusalem, they shall be carried to Babylon and remain there until the day when I visit them, declares the Lord. Then I will bring them back and restore them to this place. So Jeremiah is saying not only are the things that have already been carried off not going to be brought back quickly, the rest of the stuff used to worship Yahweh is going to be carried off, and it's going to stay there until the Lord is pleased to turn things around. And that is what Ezra is also claiming fulfillment for. So the Lord stirs up the spirit of Cyrus. Cyrus lets the Israelites go free. The Israelites, in a sense, plunder the Persians for the rebuilding of the temple, just as they had plundered the Egyptians for the building of the tabernacle. And then look at what happens in chapter 2. Basically, what you have is a numbering of the people. So it's almost like Ezra chapter 2 parallels what we have in the opening chapters of Numbers, where the people of Israel are numbered. And there's a particular concern in this numbering of the people in Ezra chapter 2, and that concern is hinted at or revealed to us in Ezra chapter 2, verse 59, when we read that of these fellows mentioned here, that they could not prove their fathers' houses or their descent, whether they belonged to Israel. Okay, so what they're trying to do is they're trying to trace the genealogies and determine that these really are genuine Israelites. And then eventually they decide, look at verse 63, the governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until there should be a priest to consult Urim and Thummim. And from various indications, we learn that this Urim and Thummim, it's like these two stones that go into the high priest's breastplate. And apparently what they would do is they would say something like, in a case like this, if these men are of Israel, give Thummim. And then the high priest would reach in and he would draw one of the stones out. And if it was Thummim, they were, this is the way that they determined the Lord's decision on this. And the high priest, in a sense, was acting as a prophet. One of these guys that's listed here, Meremoth, the son of Hakkoz. Look in verse 61, of the sons of the priest, the sons of Habiah, the sons of Hakkoz. Over in the book of Nehemiah, in Nehemiah chapter 3, verses 4 and 21, we read of this fellow Meremoth, son of Hakkoz, which tells us that the sons of Hakkoz were verified. A priest arose, they did the Urim and Thummim probably, and they determined that these guys are indeed of Israel. This brings us, this idea of their genealogy brings us to an issue that arises later in the book. And that issue is the need for the line of descent in Israel to be pure. And this reality, it can create some, I think, mistaken conclusions about ancient Israel. So I just want to negate those mistaken conclusions and then argue for what I think is the correct conclusion. So here's what I want to say. Biblical Israel, ancient Israel, Old Covenant Israel, was not a racist people. And Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not a racist God. Now, why do I say that? I say that because at the end of the book of Ezra, in chapters 9 and 10, Ezra is mourning over the fact that some Israelites have intermarried with non-Israelites. And what I'm saying to you is this is not the equivalent of interracial marriages in our culture in our day, all right? So it's not the case that Ezra, the book of Ezra, is an ancient world version of Bob Jones University, forbidding interracial marriages because they're racist. That's not the issue. The issue, both in Ezra and in Nehemiah, is that these people with whom Israelites are intermarrying, these people are unrepentant idolaters. That's the issue. These are people who are not leaving the worship of Yahweh. They're still committed to the worship of these false gods. And what that does several things. One thing it does, look at Ezra chapter 9 and look at verse 2. As Ezra is mourning the fact that this has happened, he says, they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race, and if you're looking at the ESV like I am, you see a little number 2 after the word race, and you drop your eyes down to the bottom and it says Hebrew offspring. And that word offspring is translating the word that the King James rendered seed. What this is telling us is that Ezra's concern is that the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands. Now, why are they concerned with the holy seed? They're concerned with the holy seed because there was a promise made about the seed of the woman. And then eventually that promise was clarified that it was going to come through the seed of Abraham, through the seed of Judah, through the seed of David. And then they faithfully traced David's line of descent. So the problem with this intermarrying with unrepentant idolaters is that they are endangering the line of descent of the Messiah. Not merely because of the racial aspect of it, because we know from Matthew's genealogy that you've got Ruth the Moabitess in the line of the descent of the Messiah. But what's the issue with Ruth? The issue with Ruth is she said to Naomi, your God will be my God, and your people will be my people. She's saying, I'm done with those Moabite gods. I'm exclusively devoted to Yahweh here, and I'm going to die in Yahweh's country. That's what Ruth says. These unrepentant idolaters that the Israelites are intermarrying with, they are still committed to their gods, and Ezra makes plain that that's creating a situation that is exactly what got Israel exiled to begin with. So he says down in verse 7 of chapter 9, from the days of our fathers to this day, we have been in great guilt, and for our iniquities we, our kings and our priests, have been given into the hand of the kings of the lands, to the sword, to captivity, to plundering, and to utter shame, as it is today. So Ezra is essentially saying, this is the way that our kings sinned in times past. And what king is famous for having intermarried with idolatrous women who then led him into their idolatry? Solomon, right? And when Nehemiah confronts this same issue over in his book, he also confronts a mixed marriage crisis. My eyes may not fall on it, but I think in Nehemiah 13, Nehemiah names Solomon by name. He says something like, is this not the way that yeah, there it is. It's Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 26. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? So what both Ezra and Nehemiah are saying as they confront this issue is look, intermarriage with idolaters is what got us exiled to begin with. And here we are, returned from exile, experiencing the fulfillment of God's promises, and we're committing the same sins that Israel committed before the exile, that got Israel driven out of the land. So this is Ezra's concern. He doesn't want the line of descent of the Messiah endangered. He's concerned for the holy seed. And he doesn't want Israel driven out of the land for the same sins that got them exiled to begin with. Nehemiah makes clear over in Nehemiah chapter 10, look at Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 28. He says, the rest of the people, the priests, he's talking about people that joined into the covenant, the priests, the Levites, the gatekeepers, the singers, the temple servants, and then here's the crucial phrase, and all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God. I think that means non-Israelites. So non-Israelites at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah could join with the Israelites if they did what Nehemiah describes in Nehemiah 10:28. They separated themselves from the peoples of the lands to the law of God, which is exactly what we see with Ruth. So I assert to you again, Yahweh is not a racist God. You know, He's concerned for the nations, even from the blessing of Abraham. All the families of the earth will be blessed in you. All humans are made in the image of God. Yahweh loves everyone that He's made. He's not a racist. Old covenant Israel, people like Ezra and Nehemiah, they're not racists. They're concerned for the line of descent of the Messiah, and they're concerned for the people of God not to intermarry with unrepentant idolaters and then be led astray into that idolatry and come under Yahweh's wrath. Any